Tokyo, August 9, 1945, 0600 hours, and Lieutenant General Kawabe Torashiro, Deputy Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, was awakened in his quarters by an aide whose face displayed unmistakable panic, the young officer's words tumbling out in a rush about intercepted broadcasts from Moscow and San Francisco that would fundamentally alter everything the General Staff had believed about their ability to continue the war, not through conventional military defeats which they had already absorbed, but through something far more insidious that had been eating away at the spiritual foundation of the Japanese nation for months. The aide reported that Soviet forces had crossed the Manchurian border in massive numbers, but Kawabe's mind was already racing to a different threat entirely, one that had been infiltrating Japanese consciousness through paper and radio waves, through loudspeakers and leaflets, through a campaign of psychological warfare so sophisticated that even now, as he dressed hurriedly in his uniform, he could hear American B-29 Superfortresses droning overhead, dropping not bombs this morning but millions more of those damned leaflets that were turning his own people against continuing the war. The psychological assault had begun subtly enough, back in October 1944, when carrier aircraft from Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet had dropped the first propaganda leaflets over Formosa and Okinawa, simple messages at first that the Japanese military commanders had dismissed as crude American attempts at manipulation, completely underestimating the sophisticated psychological warfare apparatus that General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz were constructing across the Pacific. Major General Arisu Seizo, Chief of Military Intelligence, had initially laughed at the American efforts, telling his staff officers that Japanese spiritual strength, the Yamato Damashii that had carried their nation through centuries of warfare, could never be broken by mere pieces of paper falling from the sky. A miscalculation so profound that by the summer of 1945, American psychological operations would reach literally half the Japanese population and contribute directly to the complete collapse of national morale. The Americans had learned from their early failures, those first crude leaflets dropped on Leyte in the Philippines that brought only 94 Japanese prisoners despite dropping 111,000 leaflets, a return so poor that many American field commanders questioned whether psychological warfare was worth the effort at all. But Brigadier General Bonner F. Fellers, heading MacArthur's psychological warfare branch established in June 1944, understood something fundamental about the Japanese psyche that his predecessors had missed entirely, recognizing that the key to breaking Japanese resistance wasn't to attack their culture directly but to separate the Japanese people from their military leadership, to portray Emperor Hirohito and ordinary citizens as victims of a militaristic clique that had led them into an unwinnable war. By February 1945, when the Americans dropped 4 million leaflets and captured 906 Japanese soldiers, the Imperial General Staff began to realize they were facing something unprecedented in the history of warfare, a systematic campaign to destroy not just military capabilities but the very will to fight. The psychological warfare branch had grown from a small experimental unit to a sophisticated operation employing Japanese-American translators, captured Japanese soldiers who volunteered to help craft messages, and even Japanese civilians who had lived in America before the war, all working together to create propaganda so carefully calibrated to Japanese sensibilities that recipients often couldn't tell it wasn't written by their own government. The sophistication of American psychological operations became devastatingly clear during the battle for Okinawa, where the Americans deployed not just leaflets but loudspeaker teams, radio broadcasts, and even aircraft equipped with massive speaker systems that could deliver messages audible from 6,000 feet altitude. Marine Lieutenant Robert Sheets, a Japanese language specialist, had arrived on Saipan with revolutionary ideas about psychological warfare, constructing powerful loudspeaker systems mounted on jeeps that could project surrender appeals into caves where Japanese soldiers and civilians had taken shelter, using carefully chosen words that avoided the shame-inducing term surrender in favor of phrases like cease resistance or simply come out. Colonel Yahara Hiramichi, the brilliant staff officer who had planned Okinawa's defense, watched in horror as these psychological operations systematically eroded the fighting spirit of troops who had been indoctrinated, since childhood, never to surrender. The Americans would first drop leaflets warning civilians to evacuate specific areas, then use loudspeakers to broadcast messages from Japanese prisoners of war describing the good treatment they had received, testimonies so contrary to everything Japanese soldiers had been taught about American brutality that they created devastating cognitive dissonance in troops already exhausted from months of combat. The messages were crafted with extraordinary cultural sensitivity, using formal Japanese language patterns that conveyed respect, incorporating references to Japanese poetry and cultural symbols that resonated deeply with the target audience, even printing some leaflets to look like Japanese currency so people would pick them up and read them before realizing they were American propaganda. One particularly effective series featured images of Mount Fuji with cherry blossoms, evoking powerful nostalgia for home among soldiers who had been fighting in tropical jungles for years, accompanied by text that carefully avoided insulting Japanese honor while making clear that continuing the war meant certain death. On Saipan alone, 18,125 Japanese civilians surrendered to American forces, a number that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, each one clutching white cloths or the surrender leaflets that promised food, water, medical treatment, and most importantly, explicitly stated that surrender did not mean dishonor when the military situation had become hopeless. The Japanese military police tried desperately to stop civilians from reading these leaflets, imposing death penalties on anyone caught with American propaganda. But the sheer volume of material being dropped made enforcement impossible, especially as B-29s from the Marianas began dropping 10 million leaflets in May 1945, 20 million in June, and 30 million in July. The psychological warfare campaign reached a new level of sophistication with the broadcasts of Captain Ellis M. Zacharias, a naval intelligence officer who spoke fluent Japanese and had spent years studying Japanese culture, even living through the 1923 Tokyo earthquake, which gave him unique insights into the Japanese character under extreme stress. Beginning on May 8, 1945, the very day Germany surrendered, Zacharias began weekly radio broadcasts from Washington that were transmitted on the same frequencies as Radio Tokyo, ensuring that every Japanese citizen with a radio could hear his messages, speaking directly to Japanese leaders by name, referencing personal conversations he had had with Admiral Suzuki Kentaro before the war, addressing Prince and Princess Takamatsu about their visits to America, using these personal connections to establish credibility that no amount of conventional propaganda could achieve. Zacharias understood that the central issue preventing Japanese surrender was the fate of the emperor, the kokutai or national polity that Japanese leaders believed would be destroyed under unconditional surrender. So his broadcasts carefully suggested that unconditional surrender applied only to the military, not to the Japanese people or their institutions, a distinction that gave peace advocates within the Japanese government crucial ammunition in their arguments against the hardliners who wanted to fight to the last man. His 14th and final broadcast on July 21, 1945, was devastatingly direct, stating simply that Japan had already lost the war, that further resistance was not honorable but pointless, that the Japanese military knew this truth but refused to admit it to save face while millions of Japanese would die for their pride. The Japanese government's reaction to these broadcasts revealed how deeply they had penetrated the national consciousness, with cabinet meetings devoted entirely to discussing Zacharias's messages, arguments erupting between military hardliners who wanted him assassinated and moderates who saw his broadcasts as a potential pathway to peace. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori privately admitted that the American psychological warfare campaign had created what he called a spiritual crisis in Japan, with citizens no longer believing government propaganda about victories that never happened, about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, about the invincibility of the Japanese spirit when they could see with their own eyes the B-29s flying unopposed over their cities. Meanwhile, the Office of War Information, operating from facilities in Honolulu and later Saipan, had perfected the art of the propaganda leaflet, producing materials so sophisticated that post-war surveys would reveal 49% of the Japanese population had seen and read American leaflets during the war, an absolutely staggering penetration rate for a propaganda campaign. The OWI employed Japanese artists to ensure the visual aesthetics matched Japanese sensibilities, used high-quality paper when they discovered Japanese citizens were more likely to keep and share well-printed materials, and carefully tested every message with Japanese prisoners of war to ensure the language and cultural references would resonate with the target audience. The leaflets themselves evolved from simple surrender instructions to complex psychological operations designed to create specific emotional responses, with one series showing pictures of American bombers with the text explaining that Japan's cities would be systematically destroyed unless the government surrendered, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact that was proving true with each passing day. Another series featured photographs of Japanese prisoners of war receiving medical treatment, eating adequate meals, writing letters home, images that completely contradicted the Japanese military's propaganda about American barbarity and created doubt about everything else the government had told them. By June 1945, the psychological warfare campaign had become so effective that Admiral Onishi Takejiro, creator of the Kamikaze Corps, complained bitterly that American propaganda was more dangerous than their bombs because it was destroying the spiritual foundation that made resistance possible. He noted with alarm that Japanese soldiers were increasingly surrendering with American leaflets in their hands, using the exact procedures described in the propaganda materials, approaching American lines with their hands raised, calling out the English phrases phonetically printed on the leaflets, "I cease resistance," words that would have been unthinkable for any Japanese soldier to utter just a year earlier. The 21st Bomber Command, operating from bases in the Marianas, integrated psychological warfare into their conventional bombing operations with devastating effectiveness, using what they called warning leaflets that would announce which cities would be attacked in the next 72 hours, giving civilians time to evacuate while demonstrating that the Japanese military was powerless to stop the attacks. The psychological impact of these warnings was profound, creating panic in the named cities, overwhelming refugee movements that strained resources, and most importantly, proving to the Japanese people that the Americans could strike anywhere at will while their own military could do nothing to protect them. On July 27, 1945, 6 B-29s dropped leaflets over 11 Japanese cities warning of impending attacks. And when those attacks came exactly as predicted, destroying the exact targets named in the leaflets, the psychological impact rippled across the entire nation. Citizens in cities not yet named lived in terror of seeing their home mentioned in the next leaflet drop, while those in already destroyed cities used the American leaflets as proof that their government had failed to protect them despite having advance warning, creating a crisis of confidence that penetrated every level of Japanese society. The Japanese military's attempts to counter American psychological warfare revealed their desperation and fundamental misunderstanding of the threat they faced. They tried dropping their own leaflets on American forces, crude attempts showing American women in the arms of other men while soldiers died overseas, or promises that Japanese forces would treat prisoners well, messages so obviously false given Japanese treatment of prisoners earlier in the war that American soldiers collected them as souvenirs rather than taking them seriously, while American leaflets were being hidden, treasured, and shared among Japanese soldiers despite the death penalty for possession. The military police, the dreaded Kempeitai, launched massive campaigns to collect and destroy American leaflets, mobilizing entire communities to gather and burn the propaganda materials, but the sheer volume made it impossible to stop their spread. In one district of Tokyo alone, civilians turned in over 2 million leaflets in a single collection drive, and that represented only a fraction of what had been dropped, with millions more hidden in homes, tucked into books, buried in gardens, saved for the day when they might be needed to approach American forces safely. Lieutenant Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, one of Japan's most brilliant and ruthless staff officers, reported from the Philippines that American psychological warfare had achieved something no military force had accomplished, breaking the warrior spirit of Japanese troops who had been taught from childhood that death was preferable to dishonor. He described finding soldiers huddled in caves reading American leaflets by candlelight, discussing among themselves whether the promises of good treatment could be trusted, whether continuing to fight for a lost cause was truly honorable or simply wasteful, conversations that would have been treasonous just months earlier but were now happening throughout the Japanese military. The impact extended far beyond individual soldiers to entire units, with the 21st Bomber Command reporting that after intensive psychological warfare campaigns, entire Japanese positions would display white flags when American forces approached, something unimaginable in the early years of the war. On Luzon alone, 7,297 Japanese soldiers surrendered, 70% of them carrying American safe conduct passes, carefully preserved despite the risk of execution if discovered by their own officers, treated as more valuable than ammunition or food because they represented the possibility of survival in a hopeless situation. The sophistication of American psychological warfare was perhaps best demonstrated in their treatment of the Emperor question, the central issue that prevented Japanese surrender. Rather than attacking Hirohito directly, which would have triggered fierce resistance, American propaganda consistently portrayed him as a victim of military extremists who had hijacked the nation for their own purposes, suggesting that surrender would actually protect the emperor from the militarists who were willing to sacrifice him along with the entire Japanese nation rather than admit defeat, a narrative that gave Japanese moderates crucial leverage in their struggle against the hardliners. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro, watching his carefully trained kamikaze pilots reading American leaflets that questioned whether crashing into ships truly served the emperor or merely satisfied the egos of military commanders sending young men to meaningless deaths, realized that the Americans had found the one weapon against which the Japanese had no defense. Physical courage meant nothing against psychological warfare that attacked not the body but the mind, not military positions but the very beliefs that made resistance possible, turning Japanese cultural values against themselves in ways that no military strategist had anticipated. The Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, represented the culmination of the American psychological warfare campaign, not just in its content but in how it was delivered to the Japanese people. Rather than allowing the Japanese government to control the narrative, American B-29s dropped millions of copies of the complete text directly to Japanese citizens, ensuring everyone could read for themselves what surrender would actually mean rather than relying on government interpretation, while American radio stations broadcast the declaration repeatedly in Japanese, making it impossible for the military censors to prevent its dissemination. The Japanese government's response revealed how completely American psychological warfare had undermined their position, with cabinet meetings devolving into bitter arguments about whether to accept the Potsdam terms, discussions that would have been unthinkable if the military still maintained its iron grip on national thinking. Prime Minister Suzuki Kintaro found himself caught between military extremists demanding continued resistance and moderates pointing to American leaflets showing the systematic destruction of Japanese cities as proof that further fighting was pointless, while Emperor Hirohito himself was reportedly deeply affected by American propaganda showing the suffering of his subjects. Major Kiyoshi Kayasawa, a diplomatic critic and journalist, documented in his diary how American leaflets had transformed Japanese society by the summer of 1945, writing that whereas early propaganda had been dismissed as enemy lies, by August the leaflets were being discussed openly in markets, in factories, even in military barracks, with citizens comparing the accurate information in American materials to the obviously false claims of their own government. He noted that American leaflets' warning of air raids had become more trusted than Japanese air defense warnings, with civilians evacuating based on American announcements rather than their own military's assessments. The psychological preparation for surrender reached its crescendo in early August 1945, as American psychological warfare units prepared special leaflets to be dropped after the atomic bombs, materials that wouldn't just announce the new weapon but would frame it in terms designed to give the Japanese government a face-saving reason to surrender. The leaflets would describe the atomic bomb as a fundamental change in the nature of warfare that made continued resistance not dishonorable but simply impossible, providing Emperor Hirohito and the peace faction with the rationale they needed to overcome military opposition to surrender. On August 6, 1945, after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, American B-29s dropped millions of leaflets over Japan explaining what had happened, not in terms of American triumph but as a tragic necessity that could only be stopped by immediate Japanese surrender. The psychological impact of these leaflets, combined with the physical destruction of Hiroshima, created what Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa would later call a psychological breaking point, where even the most fanatical military officers could no longer deny reality, though many still tried, arguing that America had only one atomic bomb, that conventional defense could still work, that death with honor was better than survival with shame. The Soviet entry into the war on August 8, 1945, which Kawabe was learning about at this very moment, combined with American psychological warfare to create what the general would later describe as complete strategic bankruptcy. The Japanese military had based their entire strategy on using Soviet mediation to achieve better surrender terms, while inflicting such casualties on American invasion forces that they would accept a negotiated peace. But American psychological warfare had already convinced much of the population that surrender was inevitable, while Soviet entry destroyed any hope of mediation, leaving Japan completely isolated, physically and psychologically. During the crucial Imperial Conference on August 9, 1945, as the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War debated whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration, American psychological warfare materials were actually present in the room, with Foreign Minister Togo using captured American leaflets to show the emperor exactly what surrender terms were being offered, documents that promised the Japanese people would not be enslaved, that they could return to peaceful pursuits, that they could rebuild their nation, messages that directly contradicted military propaganda about American intentions to destroy Japanese civilization completely. The military representatives at the conference, War Minister Anami Korechika and the Chiefs of Staff General Yumizu Yashijiro and Admiral Toyota Somu, found themselves in the surreal position of arguing against American leaflets that had proven more accurate than their own intelligence reports, trying to convince the emperor to continue fighting when American psychological warfare had already convinced much of the population, possibly including the emperor himself, that further resistance was pointless. General Annemy's own aide would later reveal that the war minister kept American leaflets in his desk, studying them to understand how the enemy had so effectively undermined Japanese morale. The emperor's decision to surrender, announced in his unprecedented radio broadcast on August 15, 1945, showed clear influence from American psychological warfare themes, never using the word surrender, emphasizing the preservation of Japanese civilization, portraying the decision as protecting the Japanese people from complete destruction rather than accepting defeat, exactly the narrative American psychological warfare had been promoting for months. The Imperial rescript even mentioned the atomic bomb as a new and most cruel bomb that changed the nature of warfare, language that echoed American leaflets dropped after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The dual voice broadcast itself became the final act in the American psychological warfare campaign, with the Office of War Information immediately broadcasting translations and explanations to ensure the Japanese military couldn't distort or deny the emperor's words. Captain Zacharias, listening to the broadcast in Washington, recognized phrases and concepts from his own broadcasts reflected in the emperor's speech, the culmination of months of careful psychological preparation that had made this moment possible, though he would always wonder whether earlier and more aggressive psychological warfare might have ended the war sooner, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. The Japanese military's reaction to the surrender broadcast revealed how thoroughly American psychological warfare had prepared the ground, with most units accepting the emperor's decision despite years of indoctrination that surrender meant dishonor. The feared mass military revolt never materialized, partly because American propaganda had already convinced many officers and soldiers that continuing the war served no purpose except satisfying the egos of military commanders who refused to admit defeat, a narrative that proved more powerful than calls for death before dishonor. In the Philippines, where General Yamashita Tomoyuki commanded over 200,000 Japanese troops, American psychological warfare units immediately began dropping leaflets announcing the emperor's surrender, including photographs of the Imperial rescript and recordings of the surrender broadcast to overcome military censorship. Within days, Japanese units that had fought fanatically for months began surrendering en masse, using the procedures described in American leaflets, approaching American lines with white flags or leaflets held high, calling out "I cease resistance" in carefully practiced English, transforming from fanatic enemies to defeated soldiers almost overnight. The effectiveness of American psychological warfare became clear in post-war surveys conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which found that 49% of Japanese civilians had seen American leaflets, with even higher percentages in urban areas where B-29s had concentrated their drops. More remarkably, 37% of Japanese soldiers interviewed admitted that American propaganda had influenced their decision to surrender, though the real number was probably higher given the shame associated with admitting psychological defeat, statistics that validated everything Brigadier General Fellers and his psychological warfare team had believed about the power of ideas over bullets. Major General Arisu Seizo, the intelligence chief who had once dismissed American leaflets as worthless paper, would later admit in his post-war interrogation that Japan had no effective counter to American psychological warfare because it attacked the contradictions within Japanese society itself, the gap between military propaganda and reality, between the promise of victory and the experience of defeat, between the call for sacrifice and the question of what that sacrifice would achieve. The Americans had understood, he said with bitter admiration, that the strongest fortress could be undermined not by attacking its walls but by convincing its defenders that resistance was pointless. The legacy of American psychological warfare against Japan extended far beyond military surrender to shape the entire occupation period, with many of the themes developed during the war: separation of the people from military extremists, preservation of Japanese culture within a peaceful framework, the possibility of redemption through cooperation, becoming the foundation of occupation policy. General MacArthur's headquarters employed many of the same psychological warfare specialists who had crafted wartime propaganda to manage the occupation's information campaign, using their understanding of Japanese psychology to transform a militaristic society into a democratic one with remarkably little resistance. Lieutenant General Kawabe Torashiro, writing in his diary years after the war, reflected that the American psychological warfare campaign had achieved something no military victory could have accomplished, changing not just Japanese behavior but Japanese thinking about war, honor, and sacrifice. The carefully crafted messages that had fallen from American bombers had planted seeds of doubt that grew into forest of questions, undermining certainties that had sustained Japanese resistance, making surrender not just possible but logical, even honorable under the circumstances, a transformation of consciousness that no amount of conventional bombing could have achieved. The Japanese military's failure to develop effective psychological warfare of their own revealed a fundamental weakness in their understanding of modern warfare, still believing that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that propaganda was less important than courage, that ideas were weaker than bullets. The zero-hour broadcasts featuring Tokyo Rose, their most famous psychological warfare effort, had actually entertained American troops more than demoralized them, while American psychological warfare systematically dismantled the ideological foundations of Japanese resistance, proving that, in modern warfare, the battle for minds was as important as the battle for territory. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the brilliant strategist who had planned Okinawa's defense and survived to write about it, would later observe that American psychological warfare had succeeded because it offered hope rather than just demanding surrender, giving Japanese soldiers and civilians a vision of life after defeat that was better than death in victory. The American leaflets hadn't tried to convince Japanese that their cause was wrong, only that it was lost, hadn't attacked Japanese culture but offered to preserve it within a peaceful framework, hadn't demanded dishonor but redefined honor as protecting life rather than embracing death. The final irony of Japan's vulnerability to American psychological warfare was that it stemmed from the same cultural characteristics that had initially made Japanese forces so formidable, the emphasis on group consensus that made mass surrender possible once the tide turned, the respect for authority that made the emperor's broadcast decisive, the pragmatism that could acknowledge reality once the spiritual framework supporting denial collapsed. The Americans had turned Japanese strengths into weaknesses, using cultural understanding as a weapon more powerful than any bomb, achieving through paper and radio waves what might have required millions of casualties to accomplish through invasion. As dawn broke over Tokyo on August 9, 1945, Lieutenant General Kawabe Torashiro stood at his window watching American B-29s dropping their loads over the city. Not incendiary bombs this morning, but millions more leaflets, white papers fluttering down like snow in August, each one carrying messages that had already convinced half the Japanese population that the war was lost. He thought about the Soviet armies pouring into Manchuria, about the atomic bomb that had vaporized Hiroshima 3 days earlier, about the military conferences where they still talked about fighting to the last Japanese, but mostly he thought about those damned leaflets, the American psychological warfare campaign that had achieved what no military force had accomplished, breaking not Japanese bodies but Japanese will, not conquering territory but conquering minds, leaving Japan with no answer, except surrender. The supreme irony was that Japan, which had started the war with a surprise attack intended to psychologically shock America into accommodation, ended it psychologically defeated by an enemy that understood the power of ideas over force, of hope over fear, of truth over propaganda. The B-29s that had once carried incendiary bombs to burn Japanese cities now carried paper and words that burned away the illusions sustaining Japanese resistance, proving that, in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon wasn't the atomic bomb that could destroy a city in seconds, but the psychological warfare that could destroy a nation's will to fight over months of careful, calculated, culturally sophisticated persuasion. By the time Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people on August 15, 1945, American psychological warfare had already prepared the Japanese nation for surrender, making acceptable what would have been unthinkable, making logical what would have been insane, making honorable what would have been shameful. The 500 million leaflets dropped over Japan hadn't just carried surrender instructions but had fundamentally transformed Japanese understanding of what surrender meant. Not the destruction of Japan but its preservation, not the end of Japanese culture but its evolution, not eternal shame but the opportunity for redemption through peace. Messages so powerful that they achieved what millions of soldiers couldn't have accomplished, the complete and total defeat of the Japanese Empire. Without the massive bloodshed everyone had expected.